On July 11, 1804, a bullet from Aaron Burr's pistol put an end to the life of Alexander Hamilton. It did not, however, put an end to Hamilton's vision for America. In 1806, a 29-year-old Kentuckian entered the U.S. Senate and breathed life into Hamilton's vision. His name was Henry Clay. For the next 40 years, the man whom Abraham Lincoln called my beau ideal of a statesman tenaciously strove to implement a federal economic policy that closely followed Hamilton's. Borrowing a term from Hamilton, he called this policy the American system. Clay's plan, like Hamilton's, consisted of three key parts. First, federal subsidies for internal improvements like roads and canals. Second, a national bank to create a uniform currency and provide loans. Third, protectionist tariffs to raise revenue and aid new industries. Clay's plan differed slightly from Hamilton's as it called for federal subsidies for internal improvements and not bounties for private industries. However, points 2 and 3 were essentially the same as Hamilton's. Clay, like Hamilton before him, believed American greatness rested upon his plan. Speaking in the U.S. Senate in 1832 on defense of the American system, he said, "The existing prosperity will be preserved and augmented, and the nation will continue to rapidly advance in wealth, power, and greatness without prejudice to any section of the Confederacy." For Clay and allies John Quincy Adams and Daniel Webster, the American system became a central tenet of the Whig Party. They spent the first half of the 19th century striving to get the system's policies implemented. What became of the American system? Did it deliver what it promised? Did it lead to wealth and prosperity without prejudice? Or did it, as some historians suggest, expose the deep ideological divisions within the young nation, and possibly set the stage for civil war? Let's examine the American system. We will first look at internal improvements. Henry Clay believed a federally subsidized plan for internal improvements a policy of supreme importance. In a March 13, 1818 speech on internal improvements, he said, "Considering as I do the existence of the power as of first importance, no merely to the preservation of the union of the states, but to the prosperity of every great interest of the country, agriculture, manufactures, commerce in peace, and in war." Clay gave two reasons for the importance of internal improvements. First, they were important for the preservation of the Union. During the War of 1812, the lack of a good transportation system severely hindered the American military effort. It was agreed by most of the leaders in government that roads and canals would aid the country in times of war. Second, Clay suggested that the government subsidizing of internal improvements would also bring about prosperity in agriculture, manufacture, and commerce. The theory was that an interconnected system of roads and canals would link all sections of the country, enabling producers to efficiently get their goods to domestic and world markets. This would enhance the country's ability to be economically self-sustaining and also allow it to compete with Europe on a global scale. The resulting strong and prosperous United States could then not be easily dominated economically or militarily by Europe. Federal subsidies, according to Clay, were vital in order for this to happen. The problem for the supporters of the American system was that not all of the nation's leaders agreed with the merits of the system. It was agreed that a good transportation system was important for the country's success. However, not all agreed that the federal government should finance its construction. Strong opposition to internal improvements began to surface in 1817. John C. Calhoun, U.S. Representative from South Carolina, introduced a piece of legislation that became known as the Bonus Bill. The bill sought to set apart the bonus and government dividends of the National Bank as a fund for constructing roads and canals and improving the navigation of watercourses. However, the real catalyst behind the bill was none other than Henry Clay. The bill passed both the House and Senate. The bill went to President James Madison for his signature. However, on March 3, 1817, President James Madison, on his last day in office, vetoed the bill. Madison's veto was based on the fact that he thought the bill was unconstitutional. He cited this as the reason. The legislative powers vested in Congress are specified and enumerated in the 8th section of the first article of the Constitution, and it does not appear that the power proposed to be exercised by the bill is among the enumerated powers, or that it falls by any just interpretation with the power to make laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution those or other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. Madison said that the power proposed in the bill was not an enumerated power, nor was it necessary and proper. The argument seems to have been persuasive with members of Congress. Madison's veto was upheld. Clay responded to the veto in his speech on March 13, 1818. He cited the Hamiltonian argument of implied powers as a justification of federal appropriation of money for internal improvements. The argument went like this: there are enumerated powers in the Constitution. Since language is not precise, there are also non-enumerated constitutional powers that are necessary and proper for carrying out the enumerated constitutional powers. These are implied powers. Implied powers are constitutional. In Clay's opinion, federal subsidies for internal improvements was a constitutionally limited power. Clay made this important observation in his speech. He said, "I will now proceed to endeavor to discover the real difference in the interpretation of the Constitution between the gentleman on the other side and myself." Clay identified the main issue concerning internal improvements. It was the interpretation of the Constitution itself. This was no small matter, and the division it caused was significant. The issue of internal improvements was about to intensify. In 1829, the nation had a new president. His name was Andrew Jackson. Jackson was nicknamed Old Hickory because of his toughness and aggressive personality. This applied to his politics as well. In his first inaugural speech, he made his attitude toward federal fiscal policy known. He said, "This I shall aim at the more anxiously, both because it will facilitate the extinguishment of the national debt, the unnecessary duration of which is incompatible with real independence." Jackson's top priority was the elimination of the national debt. Jackson believed that a national debt was destructive of independence. He went on concerning the elimination of the debt. "Because it will counteract that tendency to public and private profligacy which a profuse expenditure of money by the government is but too apt to engender." In Jackson's opinion, the elimination of federal debt was necessary to curb government spending. It seems Jackson's logic was similar to the existence of a federal debt ceiling today. The nation could only go into debt up to that ceiling. The difference was that Jackson's debt ceiling was zero. This limited the nation's ability to borrow, which meant the country could only spend what it collected in revenue through tariffs and land sales. Thus, excessive and wasteful government expenditures would be curbed. However, since Jackson did not believe in a protective tariff to raise revenue for non-essential government spending, a program of federal subsidies for internal improvements would be essentially non-existent. Economist Murray Rothbard made this comment concerning Jackson's fiscal policy: "Deficits and amounting debt, therefore, are a growing and intolerable burden on the society and economy, both because they raise the tax burden and increasingly drain resources from the productive to the parasitic, counterproductive public sector. It is for all these reasons that the Jeffersonians and Jacksonians, who, contrary to the myths of historians, were extraordinarily knowledgeable in economic and monetary theory, hated and reviled the public debt." On December 8, 1829, in his first annual message to Congress, Jackson again referred to the internal improvement policy. That this was intended to be a government of limited and specific, and not general powers, must be admitted by all, and it is our duty to preserve for it the character intended by its framers. If experience points out the necessity for an enlargement of these powers, let us apply for it to those for whose benefit it is to be exercised, and not undermine the whole system by a resort to overstrained constructions. Jackson here clearly points out the key ideological difference that would characterize the policies of the two new political parties in the United States. The Democratic Party envisioned a small federal government with limited powers. The Constitution was to be interpreted narrowly, allowing only specific powers to Congress. They were therefore against federal subsidies for internal improvements, protective tariffs, and a national bank. In other words, they were against the American system. Clay and the Whigs, on the other hand, held diametrically opposing views. They wanted an expansive government with power centralized in the federal government. The Constitution was to be interpreted broadly, with significant power given to Congress. They were for internal improvements, protective tariffs, and a national bank. They were for the American system. Jackson warned that the ideological differences between the two views had the force to undermine the Union itself. He also warned that he saw it as his duty to preserve the character of the republic the framers had envisioned. This meant destroying the American system. In 1830, Henry Clay proposed a bill that the federal government purchase $150,000 of stock in the Maysville, Washington, Paris, and Lexington Turnpike Road Company. The company proposed a 60-mile road from Maysville, an inland port on the Ohio River, to Clay's hometown of Lexington. The project lay entirely within Henry Clay's home state of Kentucky. The bill passed both houses of Congress. However, Andrew Jackson vetoed the bill on May 27, 1830. Jackson gave this reason for his veto. Such grants of money by the federal government have always been passed under the control of the general principle that the works, which might be thus aided, should be of a general, not local, national, not state character. A disregard of this distinction would of necessity lead to the subversion of the federal system. I am not able to view the Maysville Road Bill in any other light than as a measure of purely local character. Since the road would be built entirely within the state of Kentucky, Jackson thought the improvement was a local concern, not a national one. Therefore, the bill was unconstitutional because it did not benefit the welfare of the entire nation. Henry Clay responded in a speech before Congress, August 3, 1830. If anything could be considered as settled under the present constitution of our government, I had supposed that it was its authority to construct such internal improvements as may be deemed by Congress necessary and proper to carry into effect the power granted to it. His argument continued to be the same Hamiltonian argument he used to justify internal improvements in 1819. Clay went on. If the road facilitates in a considerable degree the transportation of the mail to a considerable portion of the Union, and at the same time promotes internal commerce among several states, and may tend to accelerate the movement of armies and the distribution of the munitions of war, it is of national consideration. In Clay's opinion, the delivery of mail, the regulation of interstate commerce, and the providing for the common defense are federal powers. Therefore, if roads facilitate these powers, then federal appropriations are constitutional. The logic of the position again was that if something was necessary and proper to the carrying out of a federal power, then it was constitutional. This line of reasoning had caused considerable division in the country since the 1819 decision of McCulloch v. Maryland. In 1820, U.S. Senator John Taylor from Virginia expressed the implications of this position. In short, this mode of construction completely establishes the position that Congress may pass any internal law whatsoever in relation to things, because there is nothing with which war, commerce, and taxation may not be closely or remotely connected. Taylor's point was that if the necessary and proper clause was used to justify federal power, then the states would eventually be powerless against the federal government. It seems in 1830 most still believed this to be the correct interpretation. Clay's arguments didn't have the force to spur an overriding of the veto. The die was cast. Jackson would go on to veto additional internal improvement bills, and the Whig Party's dream of an official federal policy of systematic subsidies for improvements ended. After Jackson's veto, John Quincy Adams lamented, "I fell, and with me fell the system of internal improvements by national energies." They would have to wait for a future president from a new party to revive their vision of internal improvements. The Clay-Jackson drama was just beginning.